On today's video, I'm playing around with the random expression in Adobe After Effects to create some flickering opacity transitions. Quick disclaimer, this is obviously kind of a more advanced tutorial. If you're not familiar with the language of expression, things are going to get a little confusing at times. However, I am going to be creating an animation preset that is really simple to use. It's going to be drag and drop, totally keyframeless. Those transitions are going to stick to the in and out points of your layer, so no matter where you trim them or move them, they're going to work. Now this animation preset is going to be available on my brand new Patreon page. So I set this up so starting now and in the future I'll be able to upload all my project files as well as animation presets and even some exclusive tutorials on there. And each month I'm also going to be going back through my catalog of tutorials and pulling out old project files as well as animation presets. So that's going to grow really quickly. It's going to be a great bang for your buck. Follow the link in the video description to go check that out. Alright, so I've got this basic map here of the southern states in the US. All the states are broken into different shape layers, and I want to, by the end of this, create a nice transition in where they're all flickering in, they stop, and they're solid like this. So random is really basic, and what it does, it allows you to, with every frame, it will randomly generate a value in between two values. So if I go down here and grab Texas, and let's just hit T for opacity. I'm going to hold Alt, click the stopwatch, and add the random method here. Now in the parentheses you have what's called the argument, so you have to enter values there. If I just don't enter any value, it's going to randomize between 0 and 1. And that might be useful in some cases, but for opacity, it's kind of worthless right now. So if you see, if I go frame by frame and look at the parameter there, it's going between 0 and 1. However, if I just input one value, it will randomly select values between 0 and whatever value I input. So for example, if I put in 25, now every frame, it's going to randomly select a value between 0 to 25. And you see we get this nice flickering effect. And of course, if I go all the way up to 100, it's going to give us between 0 and 100. Very, very cool. So this right here, what we're looking at, it's essentially this, 0, 100. So I can write out the full thing, or I can just write out 100. One great way to visualize what's going on is to go over here and click on Show Post Expression Graph. And now when I go to the graph editor, you can see what it's doing. It's just randomly jumping between these from frame to frame. And you can see over here on the y-axis, you can't really see it very clearly, but you have 0 to 100%. So if I go back over here, and let's say I want it to flicker between 35 and 70, now we're going to get this look. Let's go look at the graph editor again. You can see it's only flickering between those. So you kind of have tight control over, the look that you want. So as you can see, this is really, really basic. It's a lot more simple than the wiggle expression. And everybody always talks about wiggle. That's the first expression people generally learn. And wiggle is actually a lot more complex than most people think. While you have the frequency and amplitude parameters that you input, there's actually like 3 other values that you can change. This is really, really simple. So now I know how to make the opacity flicker. How can I now transition it on and off? Let's say I just want to simply transition it from 0 all the way up to 100, and I want it to flicker, and then when it reaches 100, I want it to stop. So for my second value here, I'm going to enter 100. And for this parameter, I'm going to type in value, which essentially means whatever I manually set my opacity to, that's going to reflect what that is. So right now, it's not flickering, and that's because my value is set to 100. So the second I start to bring this down, it's now going to flicker. And now it's going to flicker between, let's see what I manually put in there. I put in 43. So now it's going to flicker between 43 to 100. And the cool thing about this is now I can use keyframes to create my transition. So if I go over here, I set a keyframe and make sure that this is set to 100, and then go back here, this is set to 0, and I go to my graph editor, check out what I just created here. Pretty cool. And I can go back here, grab these, and let's say now I want to transition this out. I'm going to copy, paste, and then right click, Keyframe Assistant, Time Reverse Keyframes. And if I bring this over here, and I actually have to trim this as well. I need to make sure that it's trimmed. And now we have our flickering opacity transition in as well as out. And you can see I can play with these handles here, get a different look. But let's say I want these to animate up to a different, I want to be able to control that final opacity value. So watch what happens if I grab these 2 final opacity values and I bring them down from 100. Now it's going to flicker because that second value is set at 100. If we go back to the expression, it's because this is set at 100. So now I'd have to manually go back and change this if I want this to not flicker when it hits its max opacity value that I manually set. Or maybe you want it to keep flickering at the end. Maybe that's the look you're going for. If it's not, what you can do is you can go in here to this value and you can just type in key, hit enter, and then type in 2. So what that basically is going to do is it's going to say that this second value is essentially this value, whatever your second keyframe is. So now when I play this back, that's going to automatically go. And if I go back to my graph editor and select this, now you can see what's going on here. Now when I bring this down, it brings the whole thing down. So that's cool, but it still involves keyframes. So if I'm going here with like these 16 or 17 layers, I'd have to keyframe them. And then if I want to make any changes, it's kind of a lot to do. So let's find another method. I'm going to duplicate this sequence again, and let's call this one random keyframe-less. Now we'll open this one up, and I'm going to go back to Texas, and let's just go ahead and get rid of everything that we just had. I'm going to use an if-else conditional statement to control the transition in and out here. So I'm going to try to explain this as I do it. So alt-click on opacity here for Texas. Now I'm going to say if, and then add parentheses, and we're going to say if time is greater than the endpoint plus 1, basically meaning if time is past 1 second after the endpoint, because this 1 is basically going to be my transition time from the start of the endpoint of the layer, meaning like wherever your layer starts, plus 1 second. So if the time is greater than that endpoint plus 1, then we want to have value. So that's telling it 1 second after my endpoint, it's just going to have that value. So whatever I manually put in my opacity. Else, now we can just type in a random 0 value. So once again, I don't have to type in 0 value. I can just type in value, but I'm trying to type everything out so you understand what's going on. So once again, this is saying once the time goes 1 second past the endpoint, the value is going to be what the opacity is out. Otherwise, it's going to randomize between 0 and the value. And if I click on the graph editor, we can see what's going on here. So it's flickering on, and then it hits 100. And the cool thing about this is that if now I go down to 25, you can see it crushes this down to 25. And I can even go back here into this first statement here. Now I'm going to add our transition out. So that's basically going to be and if time is less than out point minus 1. So 1 second before the out point of our layer. Now if I go back to graph editor, check it out. Now I have this cool flickering in, flickering out. And check out how dynamic this is. I can trim the layers now, trim this like this, move it around, totally keyframeless. And now one thing you can see that when these flicker, it's capping out at the value. So if I want it to go all the way up to 100, what I can do is just change this from value and put it at 100. And now it's going to randomize between 0 and 100. You can see you get a different look there. Now check this out. I'm going to copy this and we'll just go ahead and paste it on all these layers. We're going to trim them back to here and then trim these back to here. This is now keyframeless. However, this doesn't look good on this particular setup. While it might look good on like one particular shape, let's look at it on one. It can look cool on one element. When you have all these together, it's too uniform. They all stop randomizing at the same time, and it's all, it's too uniform. And if you go over here to the graph editor, you can see it's not ramping up like it was before with the keyframes. As I said before, a little over a year ago, I created a similar tutorial where I used the wiggle expression in conjunction with the linear expression. So now I'm going to do the same thing but with a random expression. Essentially what this is going to do is I'm adding a secondary slider that's just going to have an expression on it that's going to drive the transition in and transition out. So it's going to tell it at the endpoint go from 0 and then a second later go up to 100 and then go down from 100 to 0 at the end. So let me show you what I'm talking about. I'm sounding like Ukromedia. In fact, I learned this from Ukromedia. Sergey always says, let me show you what I'm talking about. Go watch his tutorials, he's the man. So I added a slider control, and what I'm gonna do now is I'm gonna open this up and add an expression. And what I'm gonna do is add two variables here. So first I'll call it flicker in equals, and then I'm going to add the linear expression. So once again, we're getting into advanced territory here. So linear like remaps, like connects values together and kind of remaps them. So I'm going to use time. So we're going to use time as our attribute. And now I need to have a minimum input value and a maximum input value, and then map those to more values. So I probably am explaining this terribly. So we want to take the endpoint. So we want this to start at the endpoint and then comma, and then we're going to do endpoint plus 1. So we're saying our start value is endpoint, and then that's going to go to 1 second after endpoint. And we're mapping that from 0, and let's go ahead and go to value. And the reason we choose value is so we can manually change the opacity. Even though this will be keyframeless, we'll be able to just change the slider control. This is essentially going to be our final opacity controller. So there's our flicker in. I'm going to copy this. I'm going to paste it down here, and then I'm just going to rename these elements. So this variable is going to be flicker out, and then we're just going to change this from endpoint to out point, and we're going to do out point -1, and then we're going to do out point, and then we're going to leave the rest there. And now what we need to do is say flicker in minus flicker out, and now we've just created our driving animator. Okay, and now the problem is that the slider's set to 0, so nothing's happening. So I'm going to set it to 100, and now watch what happens as I scrub this. Check out the values. So it's going to start at 0 at our endpoint, and then 1 second after, it's going to animate all the way up. It's basically interpolating from 0 to 100. And now as I scrub over here to the end, it's going down from 100 to 0. So this is going to be not only our opacity amount, but it's going to drive that ramping up. So now we go back to opacity. I'm going to hold shift and hit T. Now I'm going to add our expression to opacity. The opacity parameter is where we're going to add the random method or expression, and then we need to use the two variables to tell it like which. We're going to use two variables to tell it this is our input value, this is our output value to randomize between these two. So if I add random, we have random here, and what I need to do is add two variables. So let's say this first one is just the opacity slider. So it's going to like do the transition in, transition out. So it's going to be our slider, or our opacity slider at a semicolon. And then we're going to have opacity amount. That's going to be our final value. So we're going to select this again, slider. But what we want to say is we want to say that it equals this opacity amount is going to be our final amount. This is when we want it to stop randomizing. We're basically saying take that slider, and then we're going to do value at time, period value at time, endpoint plus 1. So this is basically saying whatever is at 1 second after the endpoint, that value at time, that's what we want this value to be. And now we simply put these in our randomized. So we have, we want this to go between the slider and the amount. Okay, so now we have this flickering in. Let's see what happens if I go a little bit. Okay, so now I'm going to grab this. I'm going to create a quick animation preset. Save this out. And now I'm going to grab all of these, double click. Now let's bring them all over here and trim these all back to here. You could make this expression even more complex if you wanted the value to, ramp up a little bit differently. So if you want the values to like only randomize between 0 and a little bit, and then have that grow to the middle and then have that shrink back down, that could be a cool look. It'd be much easier to achieve that using keyframes. My goal here was to create like some keyframe-less stuff that's super simple, because when I'm creating map animations, it's much easier to just quickly have animation presets and be able to tweak that, as compared to like totally trying to keyframe something and then copying that over. That can be quite complex, especially if a client comes back and wants to make changes. It can be like a nightmare. So these are just cool tools to add to your toolbox. Maybe I'll play with this again in the future and create something even a little more dynamic. Okay, so there you have it. There is a keyframeless flickering opacity transition for your layers. Let me know what you thought down in the comments section. Once again, the animation preset for this is available over on my Patreon page. Link is down in the video description. And again, I just launched this Patreon page the time of this video is publishing, and I am currently going back on a monthly basis to add, content from previous tutorials, including project files. These are going to include like project files that have the GeoLayers plugin used in there, as well as project files for Google Earth Studio, animation presets, and I'm going to be doing monthly exclusive tutorials for the tier 2 patrons. So go check that out, help support the page. You're going to have some cool stuff. It's going to be a great bang for your buck. As always, if you enjoyed the video, be sure to hit the thumbs up button. If you want to see more map content like this, be sure to check out my Monday Maps playlist. Subscribe to the channel, hit that notification bell. I'll see you in the next one.